It is a truth universally acknowledged, though seldom spoken, that couples who live together will, at times, quarrel. Some disputes flicker and die before they take hold, while others blaze into something far more dangerous. And then there are those for whom argument is not an occasional eruption but a way of life. Few embodied this more than Thomas Mead and Clara Howell. By 1908, Thomas and Clara had weathered 7 years together, bound not by affection but by the relentless cycle of discord. Their latest residence, a cramped dwelling in Crook's Yard, Well Street, just off West Street in Leeds, was but another backdrop to their ceaseless battles. Thomas, a gas worker hardened by long hours and bitter nights, and Clara, a tailoress whose needle was perhaps the only thing sharper than her tongue, had moved from address to address, carrying their storm wherever they settled. In late July 1908, they found themselves in Crook's Yard, a forgotten pocket of the city with just 3 houses. It should have been peaceful. It was anything but. Their constant shouting and furious clashes reverberated through the narrow alleyways, forcing their unfortunate neighbors to live with the sound of battle ringing through their walls. Sarah Whittaker had long suspected the turbulence behind Thomas and Clara's closed doors, but nothing could have prepared her for the grim reality she witnessed that November night. It was 3 a.m. when the urgent knock at her door shattered the silence, a policeman, his expression grave, informing her that Clara was asking for her. Heart pounding, Sarah hurried next door, only to find Clara hunched over, cradling a deep gash on her forehead, her face pale with shock. Thomas stood nearby, his stance rigid, his voice unnervingly steady as he insisted she had merely hit her head against the edge of the sink. His denial hung in the air like smoke, thick with evasion. Clara, lips pressed into a thin line, said nothing, no accusations, no pleas for help. And with no official complaint filed, the matter was quietly left to dissolve into the night, like so many others before it. The evening of Friday, November 27, 1908, began innocently enough. Clara spent time at Sarah Whittaker's house, a brief respite from the unrest that often plagued her home. But later, she and Thomas ventured out together, as if the night might hold some promise of peace. That illusion shattered the moment they returned. Through the thin walls of Crook's Yard, Sarah heard it begin again. Thomas's voice, sharp with accusation, rang out, "Where's that 2 shillings you took out of my pocket?" Clara, desperate, denied it over and over, her protests growing more frantic. Then came the sounds, the unmistakable chaos of violence. A sickening thud, a muffled cry. Sarah could only guess at what unfolded behind that door. The police arrived, 2 officers stepping into the shadows to confront Mead. And just like that, silence settled over Crook's Yard, eerie and unnatural in its suddenness. For once, there was quiet. But it was a fleeting illusion. At 1 a.m., the storm broke loose again. With the officers gone, nothing restrained the fury. Shouts twisted through the air, stretching into the night, relentless. On and on it went, the turmoil seeming endless, until, finally, at 3 a.m., the last echoes faded, leaving only the weight of everything unspoken. The early hours of Saturday morning were restless in Crook's Yard. A sharp rapping against Mead's shutters shattered the dawn stillness, a voice calling out, "Get up, Tommy, it's Saturday morning." Still, there was no sign of him. Sarah Whittaker, sensing something off, knocked herself, her voice firm, "Get up, Tommy, it's 5:45. From inside, Mead's reply came, strangely hollow, "I am up." Satisfied, Sarah turned back to her own routine, tending to her family, unaware that the morning held something far darker than its quiet beginnings. It wasn't until 9 a.m. that Mead finally emerged, locking his door with a deliberate click, sealing whatever lay behind it. As he passed Sarah on West Street, where she was scrubbing the shop steps, they exchanged the usual pleasantries, an ordinary moment undercut by the weight of the previous night's violence. Then, Mead asked the question, "What do you think of her, Sarah?" The meaning was clear, Clara. Sarah didn't flinch. "What do I think of you both? If there's not an alteration soon, there'll be murder." Mead stood there, unmoving. A pause stretched between them, taut and unspoken. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, he answered, "There will in all." It was the kind of remark that lingered, unsettling in its quiet certainty. Sarah, noticing Clara's absence, asked where she had gone. Mead replied that she was at her mother's, that he would see her later after collecting his back pay. Then, without urgency, without further explanation, Mead strolled down West Street, disappearing into the city, and was not seen again that day. Clara Howell had often gone to her mother's house, but never had she stayed away all day. As Saturday stretched on without word from her, Sarah Whittaker's unease deepened into certainty something was wrong. By Sunday morning, she could ignore it no longer. She contacted the police. Constable F.W. Garbutt arrived in due course, his expression darkening as he surveyed Mead's house, shutters still drawn, the place ominously silent. He knocked, called out. No answer. It was time for action. A ladder was found, and with measured precision, Constable Garbutt ascended, reaching the bedroom window. The silence pressed against him as he lifted his truncheon, then, with a swift, decisive strike, shattered the glass. Inside, the room was barren. No furniture, no signs of life. Just a heap of rags and sacking in the corner, motionless, unremarkable, until Constable Garbutt peeled it back. Beneath the coarse fabric lay the broken body of Clara Howell. She wore only a pair of stockings. Her face, a mask of bruises. Her upper body, battered, brutalized. Medical attention was summoned, but there was nothing left to save. The initial assessment was grim. She had been kicked to death. And now, there was no doubt, no hesitation. A full-scale search for Thomas Mead was launched. The hunt had begun. Mead hadn't fled. He hadn't hidden. Instead, he lingered, weaving through the city's backstreets, recounting his actions with a chilling ease to anyone who would listen. By early evening, he had drifted into the Railway Hotel on Spence Lane, settling into conversation with John William Prendeville. The subject was casual at first, but then, without hesitation, Mead spoke. Clara took 2 shillings from my pocket, he muttered, as if that alone justified everything that followed. Then, with a grim nonchalance, he laid it out, how he struck her, how she fell. How he had gone to bed, only to wake to the sound of her, moaning, groaning, slipping between life and death. He described carrying her upstairs, as though that act might erase the brutality before it. But within minutes, she was gone. And yet, he hadn't fled the scene in a panic, hadn't wept or begged for mercy. He had stayed, sitting with her body until morning, until the clock struck 9 a.m. Then, as if it were just another Saturday, he left, to collect his pay. Not long after his first chilling confession, Mead found himself tangled in another exchange, this time with a group of drinkers, their talk turning to football. The conversation was ordinary enough, but Mead, already intoxicated, snapped. A curse, a flare of temper, then a swift blow to the face sent him sprawling to the floor. The landlord, Mr. R.A. Burns, eyed him warily. Mead was drunk, volatile, the kind of man whose trouble had only just begun. Without hesitation, Burns hauled him to his feet and shoved him into the street. Mead staggered, his voice slurred but unmistakably deliberate as he shouted, "I have done one in. Let me go back and chivvy him. If you don't believe me, take the key and go look." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. By now, dusk had settled over the city, the clock striking 6 p.m. Mead, bruised and unsteady, picked himself up from the pavement just as Robert Prust approached. "What happened?" Prust asked. Mead gestured toward the Railway Hotel, spitting his answer. "I have been in yon boozer," he snapped, rubbing his swollen eye. "That man hit me, but if I could have got hold of him, I'd have pulled his throttle out. Swung for 2 instead of 1. Then, with an unnerving pause, he locked eyes with Prust, lowering his voice to something just above a whisper. "I have done the missus in, Bob." Once wasn't enough. He repeated it, again and again, as if testing the weight of his own words. Then, finally, he elaborated, calm, matter-of-fact. They had argued. She had fallen. And he had left her there, as dead as a mackerel. By 7 p.m., Thomas Mead arrived at 5 Lisbon Court. The door swung open to reveal Margaret Shuttleworth, a woman who had left her husband and returned to her parents' house, a place owned by Mick Robinson and his wife, old friends of Mead. He wasted no time. "Think your father would let me have a sleep here?" he asked, his voice edged with exhaustion or something close to it. Margaret studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the sofa. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, watching as he sank into the cushions, weary but restless. Then she noticed his eye, bloodshot, swollen. "What happened to you?" she asked. Mead leaned back, exhaling sharply, as though the memory still lingered. "Had a scrap in the railway hotel," he muttered. No embellishments, no remorse, just a simple recounting of events, as though the evening had been nothing more than another stop along the way. Margaret said nothing more. And for now, the house settled into uneasy silence, with Mead sprawled on the sofa, the weight of the night pressing down on him. Mead lingered in Lisbon Court, but his presence was uneasy, his words laced with a cryptic weight. When Margaret Shuttleworth asked after Clara, he did not offer reassurance, only a murky warning. "If Mick Robinson knew what I've done, he wouldn't let me stay here," Mead muttered, his tone somewhere between confession and dare. Then came his declaration, stark, chilling. He had given Clara 2 black eyes. He had killed her. But, just as swiftly, he contradicted himself, claiming she was at her mother's. Margaret, weary of Mead's drunken ramblings, dismissed the words as mere posturing. By 11 p.m., she left him to the solitude of the sofa, retreating to her bed. Yet the night did not pass quietly. From the shadows of Lisbon Court, Mead's voice rose again, ragged, fevered, muttering about the murder. Morning came, but the unease lingered. Mead, unfazed, repeated his grim claim once more: he had killed Clara. By nightfall, he planned to disappear, to make for Bradford. Then, suddenly, frantic footsteps approached. A neighbor's little girl burst into the house, breathless with news that cut through the morning stillness. "The police have found Clara Howell dead." The words barely settled before Mead sprang to his feet, urgency crashing over him. "Where's my cap?" he barked. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and bolted from the house. And just like that, he was gone. Despite everything, Thomas Mead remained in the area, drifting through familiar streets, revisiting his usual haunts as if nothing had changed, as if Clara's body wasn't lying cold and broken, as if the weight of his crime hadn't yet caught up to him. But the police were closing in. After speaking with Margaret Shuttleworth, they pieced together his movements, narrowing the search to the places he felt safest. One by one, they visited his known associates, following the trail of a man who had made no effort to run. Then, at 10:20 p.m., the chase came to an end. Detective Inspector Wilson and Detective Constable Wright arrived at 14 Chadwick Place on Whitehall Road. The house was quiet, the night pressing in around them. Inside, past the threshold, past the faint scent of smoke and damp walls, they found him. Mead sat by the fire in the kitchen, warming himself in its glow, untroubled, unhurried. But as the officers stepped forward, the heat from the flames was no match for the cold hand of justice closing in. As Thomas Mead was taken to New Wortley Police Station, his voice cut through the tense silence, a grim, detached admission. "She is dead. As dead as a mackerel," he murmured. Then, with an air of cold finality, he added, "If you had been an hour later, I should have done myself in." But there was no escape now. After his interview at the station, Mead was transferred to the town hall, where he faced the inevitable, charged with the murder of his common-law wife. The inquest on Clara Howell opened in Leeds before Coroner J.C. Malcolm on December 2nd. Mead, sullen and unshaven, sat among the proceedings, surrounded by the weight of evidence, the murmurs of the courtroom. When asked if he had any questions, his response was as empty as his expression. "I have nothing to say." There were too many witnesses, too much to untangle, and so the hearing stretched beyond that first day. It was adjourned until December 4th, when, after only a short deliberation, the jury delivered the expected verdict. Willful murder. And with those 2 words, Thomas Mead's fate was sealed. Meanwhile, Thomas Mead faced his first reckoning before the magistrates at Leeds Police Court on November 30th. He stood alone, no legal counsel, no shield from the weight of the charges against him. He was remanded to December 2nd, the first step in a slow march toward justice. The process dragged on, each remand marking another grim milestone: December 4th, December 11th, December 18th. By then, Mead had secured representation. Mr. E. F. Maud stood beside him, but the mounting evidence left little room for defense. On that final occasion, with all testimonies heard, the inevitable ruling came. Mead was committed for trial. And so, on February 10, 1909, the case against the 33-year-old defendant unfolded in Leeds before Mr. Justice Coleridge. The stakes had never been higher. At the defense table sat Mr. J. Willoughby Jardine, tasked with protecting a man whose own words had condemned him. Opposing him, prosecuting the case with unwavering precision, was Mr. H. T. Waddy, assisted by Mr. Bruce Williamson. With the courtroom assembled, the moment had arrived. Thomas Mead's fate would now be decided. The neighborhood surrounding Clara Howell's final moments was squalid, unforgiving, a place where hardship festered in every crumbling brick, every shadowed alley. Her house, a two-story dwelling steeped in neglect, told its own grim story when the police stepped inside. The downstairs living room was in chaos. Disorder reigned, the air thick with the remnants of violence. The neighbors had spoken of its bareness, that aside from a single wooden chair, there had been little else. That chair now lay shattered, its splintered remains strewn across the floor. At the foot of the stairs lay Clara's discarded clothing, a heap of fabric pooling like an unspoken testament to what had unfolded. Bloodstains streaked the scene, marking the path of brutality. The evidence was clear: she had been attacked in the downstairs room, stripped of everything but her stockings, and then carried upstairs. But amidst the devastation, one detail stood out: a simple card resting on the mantelpiece. Its message was stark, haunting in its irony. "Watch and pray." Millie Barker had long known the truth of her sister's life. When she saw Clara in Park Lane, Leeds, on the Tuesday before her death, there was nothing surprising about the fresh bruises darkening her skin. Clara had always been battered, always wore the marks of Mead's fury, her eyes, blackened, a constant reminder of the violence she endured. It was a cycle, unbroken, unquestioned. Until it wasn't. John Prendeville recounted his conversation with Mead on the evening of November 28 at the Railway Hotel. There, in the dim light of the pub, Mead had said it outright: he had killed Clara. Then came the fight. His ejection. And outside, in the cold night air, Prendeville saw him again. Mead, unsteady, careless, muttering his plan. He was going to Bradford. To do himself in. Yet there was no desperation in his words, only the weight of inevitability, as if the night had already decided his fate long before he spoke it aloud. Robert Prust had heard whispers: Mead had chucked his job. It was enough to make him seek out his friend, to find him in the street after his drunken ejection from the pub. At first, Mead spoke of it casually, almost dismissively. But soon, the conversation shifted, darkened. He mentioned Clara. The trouble they'd had. Then, with unnerving ease, he made his admission. "About 1 o'clock this morning, we had a bit of bother," he muttered. "And I gave her two." The words alone were chilling, but what came next made them worse. Slowly, deliberately, Mead raised his fist and pressed it beneath Prust's jaw, his meaning unmistakable, his conviction unwavering. Not a plea. Not regret. Just a man, reliving what he had done. Margaret Shuttleworth, in whose home Mead had sought refuge that Saturday night, recalled the couple's visit to Lisbon Court on the evening of Friday, November 27. The house had been lively, filled with conversation and the sharp scent of beer and whiskey. Mead and Clara blended into the crowd, drinking freely, their presence no different from any other night of revelry. But when they finally stepped out at 11:15 p.m., Margaret noted the change. Mead had had plenty to drink. More than enough to stir trouble. Dr. G.P. Humphrey, who had examined the crime scene, placed the time of death at approximately 1 a.m. on November 28. His findings painted a harrowing picture. Clara's body bore the marks of relentless cruelty. Bruised from head to foot, her flesh told the story her voice never could. Abrasions marred her head, a black eye swollen shut, her nose shattered. No fewer than 10 bruises marked her arms, while the backs of both hands were black with injury. Then, there was the broom handle. Dr. Humphrey had scrutinized its splintered remains, confirming the worst. Bloodstains and strands of human hair clung to its surface, silent witnesses to what had transpired. Death had not come quickly. It was shock that claimed Clara Howell, the rupture of her small intestine a final, brutal consequence of her injuries inflicted after the removal of her clothing. And with that, the full weight of the crime stood revealed. Here's a more dramatic and immersive rewrite, sharpening the tension and finality of Mead's fate. Detective Constable Wright had locked Thomas Mead in his cell, expecting silence, maybe resistance. Instead, Mead spoke, his words measured, his tone eerily resigned. Wright cautioned him again, warning that anything he said would be recorded. But Mead was undeterred. "Have you seen the body?" he asked. And then, unprompted, came his confession, calm, unwavering. "Well, I have done it. I shall have to swing for her. She made me do it." His voice lacked remorse, only a bleak inevitability. "I woke on Saturday morning. She had taken all my money. We got on about it. I gave her a good hiding. Then, with chilling certainty, I hope to God they will hang me. I didn't want to live." A pause, the weight of his own words settling. "How long shall I have to wait?" For the defense, Mr. Jardine argued that Mead's mind had been drowned in drink, that he had been so unhinged by alcohol that he lacked intent, that this was not murder, only manslaughter. But Mr. Justice Coleridge made it plain, unless the jury were convinced that Mead had been incapable of forming the intention to kill, they must return a verdict of murder. And when the deliberations ended, the decision was clear. Murder. Mead listened, unmoved, as the death sentence was read. There was nothing left to say. Thomas Mead's last hope lay in appeal, argued before Justices Darling, Walton, and Pickford on February 22. His defense raised two key grounds. First, that his reason had been disordered by drink, rendering the crime one of manslaughter rather than murder. Second, that since Mead had admitted to using only his fists, and a fist was not classed as a deadly weapon, the crime could not be deemed willful. Neither argument swayed the court. Both were dismissed. Yet, for a moment, the verdict remained in limbo. The defense insisted that the jury had been misdirected, forcing an adjournment until the following day. A brief reprieve, though one that held little promise. When the court reconvened, the final ruling came swift and decisive. The appeal was lost. In their judgment, the justices left no room for doubt. Drunkenness was no excuse for the taking of a human life. And so, with the last avenue closed, Mead's fate was sealed. In the condemned cell at Leeds, Thomas Mead spoke little. He expressed no regret, no remorse, only silence. For a few days after the trial, illness kept him weak, but he soon recovered. His appetite remained steady, unfaltering, as if the shadow of the noose had no hold over him. On the morning of Friday, March 12, 1909, he rose early, ate a hearty breakfast. Then, the time came. Executioner Henry Pierrepoint, assisted by John Ellis, prepared the scaffold. Mead stepped forward, his gait steady, his resolve intact. Not a word passed his lips. Outside the prison gates, a small group had gathered, mostly women and children, watching, waiting. But as the tolling of the prison bell rang out, cutting through the cold morning air, they began to disperse. And with each fading footstep beyond those gates, Thomas Mead's story came to its end.